Anyway, I want to talk about something sort of that's, I think, maybe slightly on the periphery of mainstream medicine and medical education, but which I believe very passionately should be right at the heart of how we are teaching future generations of medical students and junior doctors. And it's this idea of narrative storytelling being of fundamental importance in medical practice. And you could say, of course, as someone who's a former journalist turned doctor, I'm going to think that. And I'd say, yes, absolutely, and for really good reasons, some of which I'm going to discuss now. Even before I became a journalist, when I was at school, I was torn between medicine and writing, literature, English. I loved both. I was fascinated by my dad's stories about his patients, obsessed with them, couldn't get enough detail about medicine. But I also loved reading and I loved writing. And when I was in the sixth form, now bear with me as I try and move a slide. Unsuccessfully. I might need some help from you, Andy. I'm trying to show you a picture of Tiananmen Square. Oh, using the wrong device. There we go.
Yeah.
So I think we're of the demographic in this room that you'll probably all remember this picture. So this is Tank Man, as he was nicknamed in Tiananmen Square in Beijing in 1989. There was this extraordinary pro-democracy grassroots campaign originating from students in Beijing University, and this photo was taken by chance by a Magnum photographer of a young man, identity to this day still unknown, who walked out in front of this slow-moving train of tanks and stood there and defied them, and they came to a halt in front of him. And I remember learning about these democracy demonstrations when I was a sort of, happy sixth former who had no worries in my life at all, and being stunned by what people were doing, and in particular stunned by this image that was beamed around the world. And I could see, even as a teenager, the potency of one image and the story that this image told of courage, just absolute bravery, and clearly a desperate desire to invoke change in a repressive society. It never left me, the power of a story, in this case told without even using a single word. And I think in medicine, stories can have every bit as much power as they possess when told by journalists or by writers, by authors. And so I thought I would start by just posing a very simple question: what is a story? And I will answer this, I'll attempt to answer this with a couple of examples. So, John le Carré, great storyteller, was asked by a journalist in the New York Times one day to answer that question, what is a story? And he looked at the interviewer and he said, well, the cat sat on the mat, that's not a story, but the cat sat on the dog's mat, that is a story. And another example comes from Ernest Hemingway. Now, this one is apocryphally attributed to Hemingway, so may or may not have been told by him, but he was asked to come up with a story in 6 words, and that's a form of very, very brief encapsulated storytelling, which we now term as the genre flash fiction. So flash fiction, you can have lots of different variations, one sentence, one paragraph, but 6 words is the classic. And Hemingway's 6-word story was "For sale, baby shoes, never worn." Very powerful story. And this last example is from Ukraine. And I wanted to share this because I, as Andy said, had been to Ukraine just a month before this video was taken. So it's a video from Kherson, so in the eastern Ukraine, one of the big cities that was overrun by the invading Russian troops. And they occupied Kherson for about 6 months before Ukrainian forces successfully managed to overthrow them and liberate Kherson. And this little video, which I'll play in a moment, I hope will work, was posted by the Ukrainian Defense Force the week that they managed to liberate Kherson. And it is a woman who is overjoyed, ecstatic when the Ukrainian forces arrived in her street. And this is what she did. Can we get the sound up? Will it go any louder? Because there's a couple more clips where the sound's more important. We'll see if we can get it working.
I don't know how to pull the sound off.
Because the other two videos, the sounds. Share sound.
Share sound.
Sorry, we're trying to. No idea how to do the sound.
I don't know how to do the sound.
Okay, never mind. All right, well, what you didn't hear there, sadly, was she was singing. So she was kind of warbling and singing with absolute joy as she dug up that Ukrainian flag, which she had carefully folded up, put in plastic and buried when the Russian forces invaded and took over her town. And she did it as an act of silent defiance. So in all the 6 months that Russian forces were in Kherson, anybody who showed any kind of support for Ukraine, whether it was a flag on their phone, anything at all, they were beaten up. There were little basement torture centers all through the city. And so she couldn't outwardly express anything at all. But throughout those 6 months, she had a story she could tell herself, which was about her country, her love for her country, and her defiance. Because what they didn't know, these people who had taken over her city, was the fact that every single day they were there, she was silently sticking 2 fingers up to them in the form of a folded up Ukrainian flag. And that was her liberating her flag and bringing it out triumphantly when it was safe enough to do so. So 3 examples of stories. And of course, the thing that makes us creatures of storytelling, creatures in whom narrative is important, is the fact that we are the very furthest thing from the apple that falls from the tree. We are not like atoms. We are creatures of motive and meaning. And the way we understand our lives is not through Newtonian mechanics, it's through love and fear and shame and courage and all of the emotions and meanings that make up a human life in all its richness and diversity and unpredictability. And that's, for me, where medicine gets interesting, because on the one hand, the Newtonian mechanics and the chemistry and the hard science is incredibly important and the bedrock of good medicine. But at the same time, if we neglect the meaning aspect of being a human being, we are very, very unlikely to be good doctors. So that, for me, is the bedrock for why stories matter in healthcare. We're all familiar with one way in which storytelling matters, and it was beautifully encapsulated by William Osler, who famously said, when teaching medical students in America, listen to your patient, he is telling you the diagnosis. Sorry. So the patient's story, their narrative, is critically important as a diagnostic tool. But I would suggest that stories, their importance go way beyond their diagnostic power. They're also therapeutically of vital importance. And to illustrate that, here is a quick example from my specialty, palliative medicine. So when I am teaching students about palliative care, I like to show them these 4 objects and ask them what they all have in common. And usually, I don't think anyone ever knows, but the answer is they are all incredibly important medicines in my field of palliative care. So, champagne, a story that we constructed in Sobel House once for one of my patients was around love and romance, really. So the patient was a woman who was in her last weeks, perhaps days of life, and her husband, she wanted to do something romantic for her husband. So we organized a date night with his favorite food, champagne. The nurses found a little plastic NHS table, covered it with a white tablecloth, procured rose petals from somewhere. I think they shredded the gardens, sprinkled this tablecloth with rose petals. And it was a beautiful, beautiful experience that spoke of everything that mattered in their relationship. And in that sense, it meant everything to the patient and gave her a sense of agency over her final days, made her feel as though she had the power of doing something precious for the person she loved most in the world. The blackbird, bird song, so many patients at the end of life derive such joy from the natural world. And if you can fling the doors wide open, or better yet, even if a patient's bedbound, get the bed out into the fresh air, if that's what they would like, wonderful. And I once cared for a patient who had brain metastases from a breast cancer, and she wrote a song based on hearing a blackbird sing and feeling as though that blackbird song somehow enabled her to imagine the beauty of the world she was leaving. She was departing, carrying on in the lives of her husband and her young son, who she was so desperately heartbroken to leave. And I would have liked to play it for you, but fortunately haven't attempted to, because we can't get the audio to work. But this song was played at her funeral, and it was magical because it was her voice singing on into the future, singing to her family and all the people she loved of how much they meant to her. And that's a pretty remarkable story to tell from beyond your grave. The nail polish, the blue nail polish, is a Ukrainian example of palliative care. After I taught in a couple of hospices in Ukraine in 2022, one day one of the consultants there sent me a tweet, and the tweet was of a patient's fingernails. It was shared with permission, and the patient, she had asked the patient, what can I do for you that would cheer you up, that would mean something to you? And the patient said, I want a manicure. Said, no problem, I'll find you a manicurist. We may be at war, but we'll sort it. Found a manicurist who came into the hospice, and what she wanted painted on her nails was a Ukrainian flag on every single nail, so that when she died, which she knew she was shortly going to do, she would be celebrating her country. And finally, the bull is another Sobal House specialty. So we cared for a farmer once who was also close to the end of his life, asked his wife what would really make him happy. Was there anything in particular? And she said, well, yes, frankly, it's his prize-winning bull. He loves that bull far more than he loves me. You'll have to do something with the bull. So knowing that the John Radcliffe wouldn't care at all about the health and safety issues of tractors and trailers, we got said bull into the Sobal House gardens, all the way through the Churchill to get there, and he was able to nuzzle the nose of his bull and say goodbye to it before he died. And it was an outstandingly good form of medicine. I think you'll all agree. So there are a few examples of ways in which doctors can tell stories to our patients in medicine, stories that speak of the fact that their lives matter to us. We care about the shape and form of their lives, and we are trying to help them as people as well as patients. In other words, we are caring about them. And that, as this quote from Dame Cicely Saunders illustrates beautifully, is immensely powerful because it has the potential to help a patient radically reshape their own sense of their biography, the narrative of their life. So often, if someone receives a terminal diagnosis, they are consumed with the fear that all their life now contains is misery and suffering and dying. There is no capacity for joy and beauty and love and all of the things that normally animate us. And if we as doctors can help persuade a patient to view their life differently as something that still has the capacity within it for those precious small everyday things that motivate all of us and make all of our lives good, that's a very powerful thing indeed to do. That's why, to invoke the words of the great almost doctor, Rudyard Kipling, who very strongly wanted to study medicine but was squeamish and fainted at the sight of blood, words are the most powerful drug used by mankind. So he uttered that phrase in 1923 at the Royal College of Surgeons, where he was invited to give a lecture, and he spoke very, very eloquently about the sheer power of words as a therapeutic intervention. And I know from my experience in palliative medicine that sometimes an enormous amount of morphine is what's needed more than anything. But sometimes far more powerful than any amount of drugs is the relationship you have with the patient. It's you giving them your time and care and attention, listening to them, making them feel as though they're a human being whose story is being heard, and that can be transformative. Moving on now from the individual doctor-patient relationship to the public sphere, I want to ask this question about public narratives in health. Who shapes them, and does it matter if doctors' voices are being heard in a public sphere? And I'd suggest that the answer to this question hinges on who ordinarily is shaping those public narratives. And of course, the simple answer to that question is people or institutions in society with power. Those are the people who typically shape all the big picture narratives, public health, medicine, as much as anything else. And here's an interesting example of the way in which doctors can intervene in these big picture public narratives. So this is an advert that was posted a couple of years ago by the NRA, the National Rifle Association of America. And you can consider quietly the story that advert is telling us. The NRA loathe doctors, absolutely loathe them, and constantly have spats with the American medical profession. But this was a really interesting one. So in 2018, there was across America, there was a national story about a tweet that the NRA posted. And this is the tweet. So some public health physicians had published an academic piece of research. It was peer-reviewed, high-quality research, looking at the public health harms of guns in America. And as you can imagine, they established very conclusively that the harms were significant. The NRA really didn't like this, so they posted this tweet in which they told anti-gun doctors to stay in their lane. And it incensed doctors in America that they were being ordered to stay in their lane by the NRA. So the NRA, if anyone's not familiar with them, they're an incredibly well-funded front for the gun lobby. They describe themselves on their website as America's biggest civil rights organization because of the Second Amendment, the right to bear guns, but they are a lobby group. They commit hundreds of £millions to lobbying and funding politicians who they hope will ensure gun law remains as lax as it is in the States. And this is the reaction to this tweet. So most of the people who, hang on one sec, I'm just going to try and get rid of, oh no, I can't. Oh, there we go. So most of the people who reacted with outrage on social media were unsurprisingly emergency physicians. So these are people who have seen the carnage inflicted by guns in America, particularly towards children. So these are two ER doctors in the States showing, on the one hand, the room where they have to tell a parent that their child has been killed by a gun, and the other, the detritus, the horror of a resus room after the patient, who has now died, has been removed from that space. But the tweet that was most influential and got shared an incredible over 130,000 times on social media was this one. And Judy Melinek is not an ER doctor. She is a forensic pathologist. And she was interviewed about this tweet a few days after she posted it. And she said, yeah, I obviously, my language was arguably inappropriate. But the reason I posted that tweet is because that week alone, I had already just done the second autopsy on a patient who had been killed by a gun. So when I read the NRA telling me to stay in my lane, I lost it. It is most definitely my lane. It is the flesh and blood that I am working with daily. So incredibly powerful intervention. And it is perhaps helpful to share this poll from Ipsos Mori to illustrate quite why doctors get under the skin of institutions like the NRA so much. So this is slightly out of date now. I apologise for this. It's 2022, but every year Ipsos Mori publishes their so-called veracity index, and they ask a sample of the UK population to rank different professions according to whether or not they would believe them more than the average man or woman in the street. So you have got at the bottom there, as you might predict, you've got estate agents, government ministers, advertising execs, and right at the bottom, languishing on 12%, politicians generally. And at the top, you've got nurses and doctors. So we have, as clinicians, the one thing that anyone who wants power in society, whether as an individual or an institution, has. What they want more than anything, we have got the trusting ear of the public. We are trusted because people know that if you decide to go into healthcare as a doctor, a nurse, or any other kind of health professional, you're doing it most likely because you care about people, you want to help them. You are highly regulated, in brackets, unless you're a physician associate, but that's another talk entirely. And you are expected to measure up to the highest standards of professionalism. And more perhaps than all of that, whenever a member of the public encounters a doctor or nurse, which we all do during the course of our lives, we probably encounter someone who comes across as honest and sincere and decent, because most doctors and nurses are. So that's why we're trusted, and that is a superpower. That's what every politician tries to persuade you they are, every advertising executive, every member of the NRA. But when we operate and interact with the public without even trying, they assume we are that thing, someone who can be trusted, because of the nature of our training, our regulation, and our motivation for going into healthcare in the first place. So we have got a power. So in answer to this question, does it matter if clinicians are heard in the public sphere? I would say, I would answer a resounding yes. Of course it does, because in the very nature of the fact that we're doctors gives us power to advocate on behalf of our patients. We all know that there are immense socioeconomic gradients in health. Patients typically are not powerful. If you are poor, for instance, you are more likely to get sick and you are more likely to die in British society. And that's why Rudolf Virchow, known, of course, famously for his triad, but who was also something of a social activist, if we were going to use 21st century terminology, that's why Virchow said this: the physician is the natural attorney of the poor. We can advocate powerfully and well and persuasively on behalf of our patients because of the power, the status, the education, the relative wealth, all of those things that we typically have as doctors. And so, of course, there's an argument for why we should speak out, because if we went into healthcare in order to help people, and we've got a voice that is powerful and can help people, then shouldn't we use it to that end? I want to now share an example of where that voice was really important. So January 2021, this was the point in the pandemic, which for many people practicing clinically with COVID patients was the absolute nadir point. So the Alpha variant had overrun the country. In the run up to Christmas 2021, we were still not locked down as a country. We were still having Christmas bubbles, Christmas mixing. You know, the Prime Minister did not want to be the Prime Minister who cancelled Christmas. And all the time we were watching our hospital wards fill up with ever increasing numbers of COVID patients, to the extent that, contrary to the official NHS England narrative, which was The NHS is not overwhelmed. Nothing is being rationed. Care most definitely was being rationed. In this week, this first week of January, and I had a clip to play here, which I won't play because we don't have the audio. But in this week in January, we were right into a death toll of over 1,000 patients dying from COVID.
Today, in the last 24 hours, over 1,000 people have lost their lives to COVID. Now, that's more than
every single person who has died in Australia of COVID has
died in their entire pandemic. We've lost more than the Australian death toll in 24 hours. And in hospitals at the moment, conditions are unimaginable. We have ambulances going up outside, patients who can't get out of the ambulances into hospitals because every single bed in intensive care in the wards in A&E is full. Tonight, I had messages from a doctor in London to tell me that police cars are delivering critically ill COVID patients into his hospital in London because there are no ambulances. That is how bad things are. How could government have allowed things to get so bad? Sage told the government in September to have a circuit breaker. They told the government before Christmas, you have to lock down, and Boris Johnson ignored it because he's pathologically incapable of making a difficult decision, and that is reprehensible.
A week. At this point, there were hospitals locally who were rationing their ventilators. I knew that because I was, I was working on those wards. In London, the waits for ambulances were so horrendously long, 4, 5, 6 hours for emergency category 1 responses, that the callers were saying to patients, we're really sorry, you need to try and get yourself to hospital because it's going to be at least 4 or 5 hours before you can get there. There were patients in London who were literally calling Ubers, struggling to breathe with severe COVID and arriving dead in the back of the Ubers on the hospital forecourts of multiple London hospitals because there weren't enough ambulances. And I knew this because I was talking to the clinicians who were directly involved. And when I went on Question Time, I made this point precisely because while all of this unimaginable rationing of what should be normal standard NHS care was going on, we still hadn't locked down as a country at that point. And worse than that, we were working as NHS staff in an environment in which COVID deniers were insisting that hospitals were empty. These people who would go and film at night in an empty outpatient department and say, look, it's all a scamdemic, it's not real, it's just a cold. And at the same time, NHS England was refusing to open up its hospitals to journalists. So there was no narrative to counter the COVID denial narrative. There were no images to show what was happening in hospitals. And almost as an act of desperation, really, I talked about some of what was happening on Question Time. I knew I'd get into trouble, but I just felt as though the public health demands meant I had no choice. I had to try and do that. I also...
Today, in the last 24 hours, over 1,000 people have lost their lives to COVID. Now, that's more than every single person who has died in Australia of COVID has died in their entire pandemic. We've lost more than the Australian death toll in 24 hours. And in hospitals at the moment, conditions are unimaginable. We have ambulances going up outside. Patients can't get them out of the ambulances into hospitals because every single bed in intensive care in the wards in A&E is full. Tonight, I had messages from a doctor in London to tell me that police cars are delivering critically ill COVID patients into his hospital in London because there are no ambulances. That is how bad things are. How could the government have allowed things to get so bad? Sage told the government in September to have a circuit breaker. They told the government before Christmas, you have to lock down, and Boris Johnson ignored it because he's pathologically incapable of making a difficult decision, and that is reprehensible.
Took great delight in sitting right next to Nadine Zahawi there, who was then the vaccines minister. And I pointed out that I hadn't even been vaccinated against COVID myself at that point, even though I was working with COVID patients every day. And perhaps he could explain why thousands of NHS staff still hadn't been vaccinated. He didn't. Anyway, it was an example of speaking out, to try and use a voice to do some public good. I got a number of unpleasant phone calls the next day from very senior people. There were sort of essentially not veiled at all threats about referring me to the GMC or talking to my CEO about the fact that I had done this. They didn't know that the CEO already knew. And I simply said, you go right ahead, because I spoke out because it was my duty as a doctor to do so. And moreover, every word I said was the truth. And if you really want to refer me to the GMC for that, you go right ahead. It'll be a very public battle. None of which was pleasant at all, but seemed important. And here is another slide just to illustrate why it was important. Again, I had a clip which I'm afraid I can't show you, but this woman, Kate Shemirani, was a registered NHS nurse, and she turned into a rabid anti-vaxxer. So first of all, COVID denier, and then anti-vaxxer. And there she is in the middle of Trafalgar Square in July 2021, ranting about Nuremberg's being required for doctors who were vaccinating the British public. She's ranting and calling for NHS staff who back COVID vaccines to be hanged at Nuremberg for the crime of encouraging vaccination. Absolutely remarkable. She was struck off after that, but she wasn't prosecuted. And
ask those looking at, has there been any deaths? Ask them what is in it. Ask them, get their names. You email them to me, the medical revolutionaries at protonmail.com, with a group of lawyers. We are collating all that. Are the Nuremberg trials, the doctors and nurses should trial, are they home? If you are a doctor or a nurse, now is the time to get off that bus. Get off it and stand with us, the people. All around the world, they are rising.
And it's another example of, I think, why it's important that doctors speak out. You get vitriol from people like Kate Shemirani precisely because your voice is threatening. It's powerful because it's believed, it is trusted by the public. We don't have to be involved in this horrible, messy, nasty, aggression-fueled realm of social media and mainstream media. But if we choose not to be, if we keep quiet, it won't stop any of these people telling the stories that they want to. And it's my strong belief that if you have the skills and inclination to try and be involved, you can potentially do a lot of good. At this time in July, I ended up having to speak to Thames Valley Police because I was getting so many death threats on social media, rape threats, threats against my children, that I started to genuinely feel worried. And I thought that they would sort of dismiss it as nonsense, you know, you're being silly, you're overreacting. And somewhat disconcertingly, they did the opposite, and they took it very, very seriously and said, we think it's only a matter of time before someone in the NHS is going to be physically targeted. And they put my number on a special list so that if I called from the house, a car would come instantly. Happily, there were no repercussions in the real world, but it was pretty alarming. So, when we're talking about our individual patients, stories matter diagnostically and they matter therapeutically. In the public sphere, stories matter because you can do good on a public stage by telling truthful stories that need to be heard, that may help people, and that are being deliberately silenced or distorted by powerful organisations that don't want those stories to be heard. And finally, just to finish this talk, I want to talk briefly about this aspect of storytelling, the idea that speaking out, irrespective of the benefits for your own patients or patients writ large, the idea that speaking out can be of immense benefit to you as a clinician. And what I'm getting at here is this. This is a beautiful quote by Maya Angelou, the wonderful American poet. There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. That's something you hear a lot from patients, isn't it, who are distressed at perceived failings in the healthcare they've received. The anguish of being a patient who, for example, is trying to tell their doctor about their pain and how it's blighting their life and how they're suffering immensely, only to be told or feel as though they're being told, it's all in your mind, you need to pull yourself together, there's no physical cause for your pain, go out of my consulting room, you're wasting your time. There's nothing harder, I think, than being a patient who puts themselves in a position of vulnerability and trust with a member of the medical profession and then feels as though their story isn't heard. And likewise, if you're a clinician and your experiences, your actual world that you're experiencing around you is being denied by people who have more power and a louder voice than you, that's incredibly distressing. I used to feel through the pandemic, when that rhetoric about the NHS is coping, the NHS has never been overwhelmed, it used to enrage me to the point that I almost felt like it was making me physically ill sometimes, because it wasn't true. And I couldn't bear the idea of what everybody was enduring. My NHS colleagues, I couldn't bear the thought of that just being denied and erased from the public's consciousness. But I want to just end by sharing a very particular example of this that comes from 2 weeks ago. So a couple of weeks ago on the 12th of April, so that was a Friday, NHS Practitioner Health tweeted this little announcement, and it doesn't look, it looks innocuous, but for those of you who don't know about it, the NHS Practitioner Health Programme was set up 16 years ago to address a particular need that doctors have of mental health support that is tailored to them. So doctors are known to have an immense degree of shame and stigma around seeking support for their mental health or any diagnoses of mental illness. And there are also immense problems of confidentiality around going forward. How do you go to your GP as a doctor and easily confide in them that you are suffering from severe depression? How do you ever go to the occupational health department of your hospital and confide that when you might be sitting in a chair outside the consulting room door, being witnessed by any of your colleagues there to speak about something sensitive? So NHS Practitioner Health was set up to address some of those problems, and the trigger for setting up this service was the death by suicide of a female junior doctor who was suffering from postpartum psychosis and was too ashamed to seek help, and she ended up stabbing her baby and then herself to death. And that was the trigger that caused this fantastic service to be set up. It's not expensive. It costs £11 million, which is a very small proportion of the NHS budget. And it literally stops doctors who are suicidal from killing themselves. It is so, so, so important. In order to save money, sneakily, late on Friday afternoon, NHS England announced to NHS Practitioner Health that they were stopping their funding for all new hospital doctors. They could just go to occupational health like everybody else. And it was obviously deliberately put out at that time, so hopefully there wouldn't be any media attention. And Practitioner Health put out this statement and also told a few people about what had happened. So I was, like many doctors, really horrified when I saw this. And I say that as someone who myself in the past has suffered from severe depression. I wasn't helped by NHS Practitioner Health, but I was helped by a local similar service in Oxford. And sometimes I think they may have saved my life. And I know many doctors who have been in the same boat. Just to show you, so all weekend there was an outcry about this cost-cutting exercise, and I'm just going to show you a few tweets. So this young doctor, Seb, decided to tell his own story about his mental health problems. So he describes driving to a lake to drown himself, and he goes on. And this is about a 20 tweet thread where he goes through the most unspeakable conditions of work, absolutely horrific. That's one example. So these are the lengths he goes to. He buys the rope, he decides what he's going to do, and he's going to tie bricks to the rope and drown himself. He spent all night by this lake and then eventually couldn't do it and decided to go to work and say, I can't work anymore. And his trust's response to that was to say, okay, we can refer you to occupational health. How about that? That was all he could get. And when he saw occupational health, he was told he'd have to wait for months for any kind of talking therapy. Fortunately, he's alive to tell that tale. He ended up getting help from NHS Practitioner Health, which he ended up in this tweet thread saying 100% saved his life. Twitter that weekend was filled with stories like this remarkable outpouring of openness and transparency, doctors telling their stories of severe mental distress. I thought about it and I wrote this open letter to the Health Secretary and Amanda Pritchard, the CEO of NHS England. And it's an absolutely vicious, excoriating letter. And I posted it on Twitter and said to NHS staff, to doctors, if you want to sign this letter, please do. I'll be sending it on Monday morning. 16,000 members of staff, the vast majority of them doctors, signed that letter with their GMC number, 16,000 of them. And NHS England went into a panic and a little bit of a comms freefall because they realised this was very bad publicity, because social media was filled with these dreadful stories and the anger of the letter. And on Monday morning, they reversed their decision and they announced that they would continue to fund NHS Practitioner Health. And in fact, the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has gone further and said he will fund it long term. We've only got a year's reprieve from the current government. It's a very, very small example of the anguish that goes hand in hand with your story, your experience not being heard, and actually denied to the extent that a vitally important mental health service can just be taken away at a stroke by an NHS England that pretends there isn't a specific need for the very service that stopped you taking your own life. It's also a wonderful example of this. Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, who famously said, never doubt a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. I think that all doctors are thoughtful, committed individuals. And none of us live in North Korea or Russia. We live in a democracy. No one takes away our voice without our consent. We can all use it if we want to, whether it's posting a tweet or writing to your MP or getting very angry on BBC television with the government or NHS England. It's all one and the same. We have a voice and we can use it to advocate for our patients. So in answer to my original question, does storytelling from doctors matter? Hell yes, it most definitely does. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rachel. That was wonderful.